In this revision session, we should be looking at the theme of gender inequality. We will look again at the play with the idea of inequality, but more importantly, how women are portrayed as delicate characters in various parts of the play. The consideration of this will remain rooted in when the play was written and the year in which it is set, and from the perspective of a modern-day audience. Before we look at gender inequality, however, it is important to realise that Priestley was also concerned about other forms of inequality. The most obvious one in the play is class inequality. One of the questions that's raised about why the play was written asks, was it written to change the audience's mind about how they view society? It has been said that the play is a savage critique of capitalism and the greed, and this is represented by the Burlings. They are gathered together to celebrate the engagement of Gerald and Sheila. They're with their family, they eat good food, they drink good wine. This completely contrasts how Eva Smith's death impacts their evening. She died alone, and she died hungry. So class is a large factor in the play, and it indirectly affects the events of Eva's life too. Class inequality is set up almost immediately, where Priestley notes that Mrs. Burling is her husband's social superior, making the reader aware and the audience aware at the beginning that Gerald will be Sheila's social superior if they actually do get married. The absence of Gerald's family at the gathering is a subtle hint that she disapproves of the woman that Gerald has chosen to marry. The evening is described as being modest. Another idea of class inequality is the treatment of Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, and how she is referred to as a girl of that class. The inference being she's of a lower class and therefore of less importance. Gender inequality is the idea that men and women are not equal and that gender affects an individual's living experience. The audience of An Inspector Calls can see this idea represented through the character of Eva Smith, Sheila Burling and Mrs. Burling. And as we look at these three characters, we will see where gender inequality plays a significant role in how they are treated and the course that their lives follow. In 1912, the women in the play were seen and considered to be possessions to their husbands. They did not work or have meaningful careers due to the patriarchal society in which they lived. Women at this point had no vote, had no say. Their voices were in effect silenced, but there were the rumblings of women wanting and needing equality in society. A woman of Mrs. Burling's status, however, were protected from outside affairs as well, such as the knowledge that many upper-class men frequented prostitute bars and that her son Eric drank excessively. To remove them from such knowledge is to treat them differently and therefore enhances the gender inequality that is prevalent in the play. If we look at the character of Eva Smith then to begin with, she is an invisible character. We do not hear directly her voice. Everything is reported to us via the diary that has been found by her bedside. And the inspector uses this diary to plot the events in An Inspector Calls as he moves from character to find out how each of them in turn affected her lives. Priestley presents inequality by describing Eva's life after Mrs. Burling refuses to help her. She was here alone, friendless, almost penniless, and desperate. Priestley has the inspector use lists several times to build up the struggle that Eva experienced. It reinforces aspects of her social inequality and presses forward the inequalities that were down to her gender. Eva is repeatedly presented as the innocent victim of selfishness, which began, as we know, at Mr. Burling's factory. Not only this, but Mr. Burling speaks really positively about Eva Smith. He refers to her as a good worker. But in his mind, she had a lot to say, far too much. So he sacked her, and he refers to Eva as these people. This comment refers to her class, but also refers to the fact that women weren't supposed to be making a noise about higher wages, that women were supposed to accept the wages that they were given, and they weren't expected to strike. But Eva had spirit, and Eva did strike and was sacked. Because she was sacked, and because she wouldn't have received a reference from Mr. Burling, then the act of finding work would have become increasingly difficult for Eva. She wasn't from Brumley, she was a country girl. So here she is alone, having been sacked for wanting better wages, not just for herself, but other people. And now, here she is trying to find subsequent work. We can class Eva as a victim of capitalist society, the one that existed in 1912, where businessmen such as Burling felt it was their prerogative to take advantage of low-class people if it meant that they profited from it, even if it leaves them in a poor state. This is no more true than in the character of Eva, who not only is a working-class lady, but she's female, and this sets up more barriers for her finding work. Eva, as we know, uses another name, Daisy Renton, and she ends up in prostitution. Why? Because after her factory job, she's then sacked from Millwards. Sheila played a big part in that, and this leaves Eva with no other choice than to sell her body. She has nothing else that she can use to make money. Whilst she is in a bar, a man called old Joe Meggerty, half drunk, google-eyed, had wedged her into a corner with that obscene fat carcass of his. When Eva is trapped by Meggerty, she is shaken by this event. But it's no surprise that Priestley has another man save her. She quickly becomes his mistress, and this man, as we know, is Gerald. Gerald uses his position as a male to save the victim woman, and she falls from the clutches of Joe Meggerty to relying wholeheartedly on Gerald, who she does not know is betrothed to somebody else. Gerald openly admits that she was young and pretty and warm-hearted and intensely grateful, and the reader can't help but think that Gerald sees her as somebody he can easily manipulate. She's a woman after all, and she's working class. He almost says proudly, I became at once the most important person in her life. His ego overrid his loyalty to Sheila. Eva Smith, therefore, who is working class, is seen by some characters as having little value as a human being, and he moves her into his friend's apartment. He's living mistress, somewhere he can go to and sleep with her, whilst he abandons Sheila, who suspects that her fiancé has been up to something. All of these aspects about Eva affect her life, because prostitution, a career dominated by women, is filled with danger. When she was a servant and when she was a shop worker, she was vulnerable. She was a victim. As a factory worker, she tried to raise her head above the parapet, and she tried to be active for higher wages. But because she did this, it made her vulnerable and she lost her job. Possibly one of the worst cases of prejudice towards her was where near the end she's judged by another woman. She's judged by Mrs. Burling. She goes to a charity to help her. She's young, she's unmarried, she's pregnant, and she just needs help. Prior to that, she was also treated badly by another woman, Sheila Burling, when she worked at Millwards, accused of laughing at Sheila Burling, and none of this is true. Everything seems stacked up against this character, and that's because of her class, but more importantly, because of her gender in that class. Going back to Meggerty, he's a prime example of men during 1912 and their attitudes towards women. that old-fashioned attitude towards them. He's an alderman. He's a respected councilman. But his behaviour is diabolical. But it is not surprising, unfortunately, during the time in which Priestley was setting the story. Gerald admits he's a notorious womanizer. Gerald also goes on to say that he knows that Alderman Meggetty is a drunk and he's a rogue, and he's well known in Brumley for behaving dishonestly and in a disgusting way. And he frequents the prostitute houses, and he uses his position as a man as a powerful tool over the women that just need to earn some money to eat. Sheila, surprisingly, also knows about Meggetty. I say surprisingly because Sheila is shielded from many of the grim realities of life as an upper class, middle class woman. She describes him as horrible, and she also gives an account as to a friend of hers and what happened to them. And she said, a girl I know had to see him at the town hall one afternoon, and she only escaped with a torn blouse. This reminds us of the comment about Eva being wedged into a corner, where Meggetty uses his body as a barrier to let Eva escape. So his position as an upper class male is used by him to abuse the woman he meets. He's white, he's privileged, and he's a male. And he actually makes the suffering of Eva even more unbearable. But he's not a one-off. Priestley uses him to represent that part of society who thought they could exact control over women. So not only women from Eva's class suffer at the hands of Meggetty, but also at the hands of him, women in the middle classes were also treated as an object by him. So why does Priestley include it? Well, he does because this incident presents clearly the inequality of women at the hands of men in 1912, their superiority over women, their power over women, and how women's voices were silenced or women were protected from knowing about men like Meggetty. So when they were met by them, they didn't know how to react. Another female character is Sheila. She is shielded from what men get up to, but she's a modern woman for 1912. She's more progressive, and actually she knows more than her mother ever thought she did know. So the act of hiding stuff from her doesn't prove fruitful because she knows too much. Her father tries to shield her from the subject of Eva's death. He says, I see no point in mentioning the subject, especially, and he indicates towards Sheila. Priestley using the stage directions to almost silence the act of suicide by saying we shouldn't even mention the word in front of Sheila. They treat Sheila like a girl, and she is a young woman. Being protected from the realities of life is something that happens later, where she discovers Gerald has had an affair. And Mrs. Burling is present in the room, and she says, we do not need to hear anything more about this disgusting affair. She doesn't believe Sheila should hear about it. I do believe she thinks Sheila should forgive Gerald, but she certainly shouldn't be hearing the ins and outs of her husband-to-be's indiscretions. But at this point, when we discover Gerald's affair with Eva Smith / Daisy Renton, Priestley is trying to make a comment about the gap between the older and younger generations, how women were becoming more vocal. Sheila wants to know what happened. Women wanted inclusion in society. They didn't want to feel exclusion. A powerful moment is where Sheila returns the engagement ring that she was so thrilled to receive in Act 1. What this does is symbolise her growing power. She acknowledges that the incident between Gerald and Eva has had an effect on her relationship with Gerald, and it cannot go unacknowledged. Her old-fashioned father defends Gerald by commenting that a lot of young men, he wants to go on to say that a lot of young men have extramarital affairs, they have needs. But actually, the modern audience and Priestley's contemporary audience is shocked by this. Sheila needs to know. Sheila is an example of a more progressive woman of 1912, more akin to Priestley's contemporary audience, and certainly we see the signs of a more hopeful future for the power of women in the character of Sheila, even though she did not treat another woman very kindly, Millwards, but certainly she seems to be the most apologetic for that behaviour. Another thing about Sheila is that her brother, Eric, is the male heir to the business. It is never mentioned that Sheila would be considered as an appropriate person to take over a business. Why? Because of gender bias. Again, Priestley does this to reflect the society of 1912. It wasn't a done thing to pass on a business to a female. Again, reinforcing the inequalities faced by women at the time in which this play was set. Our third woman is Mrs. Birling. When Mrs. Birling discovers that her son is a heavy drinker, Priestley uses the stage directions of staggered. She perpetuates the idea of a woman being shocked by the realities of life, unlike her daughter. It isn't true. You know him, Gerald, and you're a man. You must know it isn't true. If you look closely at the wording here, she places trust in his understanding and knowledge simply based on his gender. She uses the gender of Gerald to reinforce the differences and the inequality between a male and a female, between reliability and unreliability. Gender stereotyping is certainly part of Mrs. Birling and who she is. So us as an audience, what do? Well, we question whether she's deliberately blind to anything she does not want to see. When the inspector comes round, she dismisses the news that Eva's suicide would have anything to do with them or could be of any interest to a family like theirs. Her cruelty, however, truly shines when she offers Eva no compassion. The inspector summarises this when he comments, "She needed not only money but advice, sympathy, friendliness. You've had children. You slammed the door in her face." The cruel attitude and behaviour of Mrs. Birling towards another woman perhaps says more about the class inequality than the gender inequality, as Mrs. Birling's quite comfortable in her position. She's quite comfortable being a middle class woman. She doesn't need to worry about money or food. What she needs to worry about is keeping her reputation. The playwright reinforces how gender inequality was more apparent the further down the social ladder you were. Women did not always support other women, and this sad fact is portrayed through Mrs. Birling. So all in all, what is Priestley's message? Well, in 1912, women were subservient to men. All a rich woman could do was get married. A poor woman was seen as cheap labour. By 1945, when the play was actually written and first seen by an audience, we see a difference. There had been 2 world wars. Women had begun and earned a more valued space in society. They were seen and looked upon as more equal than in 1912. Mrs. Birling represents the traditional wife of 1912, her responsibility to show her daughter how to behave as a woman and a wife. Society's impact here on gender roles being reinforced by one woman to another. Sheila, however, is more progressive. She's more of a representation of the modern woman who defies previous boundaries set for her gender. Being inferior to men, still in 1912, Priestley did not believe in this ideology, and he shows us this by his ability to present Sheila's mother as a cold and unlikable woman By doing so, we see the writer presenting his vision of women having a voice and being equal to men. There are several key quotations which underpin the inequality faced by women in an Inspector Calls. None more prevalent than Burling and his dismissive attitudes towards female employees, particularly in the incident with Eva when she striked over low wages. He excuses his businessmen's attitude and he says we were paying the usual rates, and if they didn't like those rates they could go and work somewhere else. This is a simple solution to him. But jobs weren't easy to come by. Jobs like Eva's were hard to keep and hard to live on the money you received for your hours. His dismissiveness is, well, if she doesn't want to work for this wage, she should just leave. Completely showing how genders were viewed with flippancy, the female gender, by big business and capitalist leaders like Burling. Women are also viewed as easy amusement, a male comment, young, fresh, charming, to describe Eva Smith. These words resonate to us about what a victim she was, how attractive she was, and how her attractiveness unfortunately brought unwanted attention by men such as Megati and also Gerald and Eric. Mrs. Burling's old-fashioned views about women also underpin the inequality faced by women, where she thought that women required a man for support. Her comment to the inspector was that if the man refused to marry her, Eva, and in my opinion she ought to be compelled to, refers to the gender bias notion that a woman cannot go it alone. She needs a man by her side, and if the father of this child had offered to stick by her, then despite how the relationship occurred in the first place, Eva should, as a female, accept his offer. Mrs. Burling reinforces this idea of men being more important than women when she tells Sheila that when you're married you'll realise that men with more important jobs to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on the business. This disheartening comment to Sheila almost explains Mrs. Burling's submissiveness when she doesn't want to hear how men of her husband's class behave when they're not at home with their wives. The rather depressing idea that her husband might be like Megati, that he might go to these places like Gerald and drink and flirt and behave badly. It's almost apparent in this quotation here that she expects it to be happening behind her back, and that Sheila ought to expect Gerald to behave in that way too, as modern audiences were shocked by these words from a mother to a daughter. So too with the 1945 audience. But this is what gender roles were like in 1912, and it's important to acknowledge that that's how they were reinforcing gender stereotypes from generation to generation. As previously mentioned, however, Sheila is that hope of the future generation taking control of their lives, taking control of their own voice. A possible exam question could be, how does Priestley explore gender in an Inspector Calls? I'd like to finish this revision session by reading through this answer. You will see references to context, you will see references to subject-specific terminology, you will see a detailed exploration of how J.B. Priestley presents gender in an Inspector Calls, the embedded quotes, the knowledge of Sheila and Gerald's relationship, and how these two characters in particular present the roles of gender in the time that an Inspector Calls was written about. Priestley uses the characters of Gerald and Sheila to explore the pronounced differences between men and women in Edwardian England, particularly in the middle and upper echelons. As a keen advocate of women's rights, Priestley uses Sheila to underscore female vulnerability across society and the urgent need for personal and collective change. In contrast, Gerald, a young, handsome man about town, an emblem of an intractable upper middle class, sees no reason to modify his behaviour at the play's fatalistic denouement. In stressing these different gendered attitudes towards change, Priestley draws his audience's attention to an unfortunate but fundamental reality. While the privileged few, Gerald specifically, and privileged men more generally, may and probably will resist the new order, everyone else, Sheila and women everywhere, must forge together to enact positive change in post-war Britain. Sheila Burling starts the play a pleased and excited young woman who, though undoubtedly happy, is blind to society's ills. How horrible! Was it an accident? She can no more conceive of an unhappy future for herself as she can the brutal suicide of another person. Sheila's naivety, ignorance and infantilized nature are also evident in her use of language. Mummy, Squiffy, and her passivity towards the opinions of others at the start of the play. I'm sorry, Daddy. Her vulnerability as such is neatly summarised by Mr. Burling. Clothes, not only something to make 'em look prettier, but, well, a sort of a token of their self-respect. Her precarious position, despite being a member of the privileged classes, is made clear. Sheila must wait prettily and obediently for a husband. She's utterly powerless and desperately needs change. In contrast to Sheila, Gerald is presented as having independence, social standing and authority. Burling panders to Gerald. You ought to like this port. And he is able, through monetary means and his father's business, to produce the very ring his fiancée desires. The inspector's visit prefers Sheila the means to observe society in microcosm and accept her part in Eva's suicide. So I'm really to blame. As early as the end of Act 1, we are able to discern Priestley's crafting of Sheila's awakening, a move perhaps in line with the historic vote for women in 1918 and 1928 to demonstrate the power women might have should they embrace change and take responsibility for themselves and those around them. The essay is a useful tool to have to see how you can put all of these ideas that we've gone through today about gender inequality in an essay form, and how in an essay you can look at two characters who represent the male and the female, and how J.B. Priestley uses these two characters to present this idea of gender inequality. The positive note about gender inequality in an Inspector Calls, however, is through the character of Sheila. The positive independence that she may gain through the course of this story, as she accepts responsibility for those people around her, how she embraces responsibility. And this is all done through Priestley's careful crafting of character, through his use of dialogue and also through stage directions. Thank you very much for listening.